Gevulot is a decentralized proving layer. It's incredibly important because it's the one piece of that stack that you need the most compute to do it. You have all these rollups, they all need to generate proofs. These proofs get verified on Ethereum. Right now, 100% of them are running the provers in a centralized fashion. And we sort of saw this. They're all sort of moving in the direction of decentralizing, but they're kind of focused more on sequencing and decentralizing that piece, and then in some other cases kind of on the data availability piece, etc. And no one had really thought about this proving stuff very much, so we decided to take it upon ourselves to see if we could figure it out.
I've been away for like a week, and then all of a sudden the amount of growth that has transpired over that course, it's been crazy. Do you think it's as simple as the institutions just buying up a lot of Bitcoin and just running out of like the whole like supply shock that's happening in the OTC? Or do you think there's more to it?
For a little bit of context, I've been in the blockchain space since about 2012, so I've seen quite a few of these cycles. And as much as, it feels nice attributing some single cause or some overarching narrative, I feel like most of the time no one really knows why things happen. At this point, I think you could even argue that there's like almost a self-fulfilling prophecy where because people are expecting it to happen in the cyclical fashion, they kind of invest as if it was happening in a cyclical fashion, and then that pushes it to occur in that way. But I mean, the ETF for Bitcoin is definitely like, even like ignoring any kind of inflows of money back in 2013 to 2016, people were talking about Bitcoin ETFs already. And back then it was like this insane thing somewhere in the future, and some people were kind of trying to get it done, and it never transpired. And I think for a long time people just thought it was not going to happen. So it's like, I think that's a big moment just in and of itself. Like, who'd have thought that we would get this far? So yeah, but in terms of the actual action, I think what I've found interesting about this market in particular as compared to previous markets is that it's been so quiet on the mainstream sort of media front. Like I would almost say like only this week or last week did we start like surpassing the newsworthy, threshold. And we were already almost at all-time highs. I don't think that has ever happened before. Like before, the mainstream media, has seen 100% rise, and they've, been like, wow, like something's happening. But now, like most people in the world do not even know that Bitcoin is at all-time highs, essentially. And so it's very interesting to see what happens when they do realize. And I think, yeah, I'm just curious to see how this cycle will play out, especially since we now have like higher interest rates, and it's a very different environment than we've had before.
I would have to agree with you, Teemu. I think that when we look at where we were last cycle, at 67K, I mean, it was completely different. It was, me working in the industry in the cybersecurity space. I just remember how busy I was, and I'm not as busy right now. And I talk to my friends that are in marketing, they're not as busy right now. So that leads me to believe that the retail is not quite here yet, although I think the meme coins will say otherwise. What we've seen, recently with Shiba Inu and Pepe and some of these, community projects that are taking off. But I'd like to get back to something that you mentioned in terms of people are investing cyclically because they almost expect that. How does that impact you as a founder? You're a builder yourself. Does that make it a lot more predictable? Does it make it easier? Does that make it more challenging?
It's kind of a mixed bag. So I mean, the downside of the cyclicality is that you do have these long periods of time when no one cares, investors don't care, it feels like there's no users, it feels like there's no nothing. And that's quite hard, I think, psychologically for a lot of people to work through. And also, like, it is genuinely a struggle oftentimes in bear markets for companies to stay alive, because like they kind of, in a bull market, you can kind of raise and you can continue to raise your valuations. And then in the bear market, suddenly it's completely flipped and you're kind of like struggling to find enough to survive. So I think it's difficult. I don't know that it's more difficult than in some other industry. It's a bit different. And certainly like there are not that many industries in the world where you can get the kinds of resources that you can in crypto if you're doing something important. And then the market, gets to the right spot as well. So like, I think there is a lot of benefit to that as well. So yeah, I don't know that it's really, positive or negative. It's a bit of both.
You said that you've been in crypto since 2012. Talk to me about your journey. How did you get into it, and what led you to get to a place where you're like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna build my own stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, I was kind of back then. I was in university, and I was sort of headed towards a career in finance. And I'd been investing in sort of stocks on a very small scale since I was quite young. I found that very interesting, just sort of understanding how different big companies operate and, trying to predict kind of where things will go. And then I went to work for a large wealth management company, during my time in university. And I got very disillusioned with the system. Like all the incentives that I thought should be in place for wealth management were completely wrong. And then, I wrote my thesis on the Basel Accords, which basically dictate how banks can hold assets or what kinds of assets they need to hold. And, there's just been 2008 and so on, and they were trying to improve the situation. And lo and behold, like nothing ever changed. And now, back then they were talking about like Basel 3, and now at some point Basel 2.5 came around as like a compromise solution, so they would never actually need to improve. As I've just a bit of more context, as I've aged, I've understood better why the financial system has ended up the way that it has, and I'm no longer quite as radical about completely changing it. But the reason originally that pushed me towards Bitcoin, when I heard about it, a friend of mine had just heard about it somewhere in the bowels of the internet, was really just the fact that you had this like opportunity to try to design a new financial system. And I don't think at that point there had been no other opportunities like that. I mean, you could argue still that crypto is the only place where you can experiment with new governance features and things like that. So that was kind of the impetus. We then ended up starting a kind of brokerage exchange called Coinmotion, still around, it's the biggest one in the Nordics. I mean, this was, there was just Bitcoin. It was like, this was what exchanges and brokerages were. You could buy one thing, and that one thing was Bitcoin. And so we did that for a little while. I personally didn't really enjoy it though. And so then I ended up going down other paths, but that was where it started.
And then from there, did you discover Ethereum and you started dabbling in that? Or like, how did you get to a place of, going beyond Bitcoin?
Yeah, so we sold the exchange, I think in 2015. And then I was just a little bit bored with Bitcoin. Like it doesn't really do very much. There wasn't a lot of opportunity to do interesting things. And so I sort of took a step back for a little while, and then I started at some point paying attention to Ethereum. When the Ethereum white paper came out, I have to admit, I read it and I was like, this is never going to work. Boy, was I wrong. But I was also quite young, and a lot of the Bitcoin community thought that, right? So it was sort of like that. I think that was almost a majority sentiment, you could say. But then people started putting out ideas on like the kinds of applications you can build, and the first ones were kind of insane, right? Like it didn't feel practical or anything. But then you started getting more and more stuff that felt like you can actually do really interesting things, which then kind of culminated in DeFi, I think. But so back in like 2016, 2017, I kind of started getting more and more into the Ethereum ecosystem. And yeah, I mean, then I've kind of kept going with that. Like I've never felt like a strong allegiance to any particular brand. I'm much more interested in the technological possibilities. I think there's a lot of power in culture and community, but like having seen Bitcoiners turn into maxis, and then sort of like you could argue a subset of Ethereum users turn into maxis, and like this is bound to reoccur with every new big success story. But it's always kind of a shame because I think there's a lot of missed opportunity and a lot of sort of willful ignorance towards where the technology is moving. Like the edge keeps moving, and then at some point these communities kind of like just decide to stop moving. Yeah.
So you think that's kind of what happened with Ethereum? Although there are new chains coming up that are a lot more technologically advanced, but people are sticking with the tried and true.
I think it's happening a little bit, and it's much less bad as it was with Bitcoin, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there is kind of some, like, the culture is still one, like it was started as with sort of an ethos. It's like, we'll keep moving forward, we'll keep exploring. It's just more exploratory in nature, but you do have this accumulation of kind of stakeholders, products built on top in Ethereum's case, things like that. And once you have enough of those, I think it's just very, very difficult to move forward faster. And then at that point, I think you start, like, the only place where you can still kind of move quite quickly is in changing the sort of financial elements of it. And so I think that's what's happening to Ethereum to some extent. But Ethereum is able to kind of maintain some momentum by employing the Rollup kind of scaling roadmap and pushing the innovation out to some degree. But I think over time it's inevitable for that to continue slowing to some extent.
And I imagine that led you to the path that you're on now, where you're building, help me pronounce it, Gevulot, right?
Gevulot, yeah. I don't actually
Gevulot.
know if that, so it stems from a Hebrew word, which means barriers and borders. It's I got it from this book by a guy called Hannu Rajaniemi, who's a Finnish sci-fi author. And in the book, it's like this, they all have like these sort of neural implants and brain-machine interface type things. And then they have this communication protocol that uses this very granular cryptography to, it's kind of like viewing keys on data in the privacy world. And I like the concept, but I'm pretty sure that my friends who would know how to pronounce it would think I'm also pronouncing it wrong. So it's sort of like a pronounce as you wish type name.
Sure. Well, I mean, the name sounds fitting, but I want to learn more about what inspired you to build Gevulot. Why do you think we need this? And just a little bit more detail about, the value proposition.
Yeah, so Gevulot is a decentralized proving layer. I think the easiest way to see it is as part of the modular stack. So in the modular stack, you kind of have like the verification settlement layer. You have sequencing, data availability, and proving in some order, depending on how you want to picture it. And the proving side is something that hadn't when we started hadn't been really thought about very much, and I think it's incredibly important because it's the one piece of that stack that kind of, you need the most compute to do it, and people are the most sort of, I guess you could say, cost sensitive because it's such heavy compute. So yeah, well, let me give the backstory. So basically, you have all these rollups. They all need to generate proofs. These proofs get verified on Ethereum. Right now, 100% of them are running the provers in a centralized fashion. And we sort of saw this. They're all sort of moving in the direction of decentralizing, but they're kind of focused more on sequencing and decentralizing that piece, and then in some other cases, kind of on the data availability piece, etc. And no one had really thought about this proving stuff very much, so we decided to take it upon ourselves to see if we could figure it out. Because, as I was saying, when you have this like heavy compute thing, it is a lot more susceptible to centralization than many other things would be. So the more that proving costs money, basically the higher the fees on zkRollups. So they want that to be as cheap as possible. And oftentimes the cheapest way to do things is centralized. And so this is kind of like the nut to crack, because if proving remains centralized, then you do have this situation where all the rollups, they're not like, you can't steal anyone's money by shutting down the company doing the proving, but you can shut the system down. And so that feels very antithetical to what the purpose of rollups are in scaling Ethereum. And so there's a lot of security assumptions that that do not really apply if you have a centralized prover. And so that's what we're trying to do, is build a system which basically makes it very easy for all of these rollups to access decentralized proving and make it very cheap in the process, because that's important.
You mentioned that nobody has really thought of this before. Why do you think that is? Are you the lone ranger here, or are there other solutions out there offering something similar?
Yeah, so there are other projects. When I said nobody was really thinking about this, I mean like the rollups weren't really considering it very much, because they were mostly engaged in figuring out decentralized sequencing at that point. I mean, they largely still are. There are some projects, like I think one of the earliest things I saw in this direction was Nil Foundation's Proof Marketplace. It sort of serves a pretty different kind of use case than what we're going for. You could also argue that Mina, which has this thing called Snarketplace, is like another. It's very similar to Nil's Proof Marketplace, but has a similar structure. The Proof Marketplace in this case just means that you like put up like kind of like a bounty or a bid, and then you hope that someone else does this, proving workload for you in a sort of exchange like transaction. So there were some people thinking about this. I think like because the rollups weren't thinking about it very much, there wasn't a lot of thought, and a lot of the thought that did happen around this happened kind of without a feedback loop with the end user to some extent. And so, for example, these proof marketplaces, they don't give you really any guarantees at all. And almost every use case, if you think about a rollup, you have some constraints around performance, around liveness, around cost, etc., that you need to meet. And so now people are thinking about it, but this is a very recent phenomenon. I think, like largely in the last few months, it's become a hot topic.
So are you seeing layer 2 rollups that are going about it where they're decentralizing the proof mechanism?
Yeah, so they're starting to now think about it and think through the implications.
What are the implications of not doing it?
Well, the implications of not doing it are that like a government could at any point shut down any of the rollups if they're all centralized or doing centralized proving. There are some theoretically possible designs that don't include decentralized proving, that like you could maybe you could imagine something like, okay, we're going to use a centralized prover, but if that fails, then we do X. So there's designs like that are possible. The problem kind of becomes that the centralized prover, if you only have one, or like that's sort of the dominant one, then you end up, if we imagine that everything is ZK, like and this might be a radical notion, I don't know, depends on if you're in the ZK industry or not, I guess. But it's like ostensibly possible that there's like some huge subset of all computation that is going to be proven and verified on blockchains in the future. So then if you have like these huge chunks of that go to one prover or one organization, then we end up in a very similar looking situation to what we have in the cloud, sort of Web 2 cloud landscape, where you have your AWS, you have your Microsoft, you have your Google, and that's about it. And obviously, in terms of like, no one can take over. If AWS was to shut down, there's no company that has enough compute to just like take over the reins. And so this is the issue with these kind of like hybrid solutions, is that at scale, they sort of stop functioning simply because of the volume of proving that needs to be done, or you know, how heavy the compute is. So yeah, the idea that, you know, we want to bring forth is that like it's really important to start distributing that out to a larger group of smaller organizations, and trying to ensure that it sort of stays that way, or this size of the group increases as opposed to decreases.
So where along your journey are you? Are you still developing, still trying to find some use cases, or do you have like specific layer 2 solutions that are, you know, interested in your solution?
Yeah. So, well, in terms of development, so the big milestone that we're very focused on right now is our Devnet launch on March 25th. So our Devnet is basically a permissioned version of this system. So it doesn't have consensus and it doesn't have economics, but it has the whole proving verification pipeline. So you can deploy any prover, you can generate proofs, you can verify proofs, etc. So that's launching March 25th. And that's already up and running, but we're currently stress testing it, and we just started onboarding developers to that. And we're working with a whole bunch of different organizations, trying to figure out like how, like it's mostly a question of like how they will approach proving, and then how we accommodate that. So we're not really telling, you know, we work quite closely with the Aztec folks to try to support them as they go into their next testnet, which is testing decentralized sequencing and proving. And there it's like, you know, they set their things up in the way that they want to set them up, and then we figure out how we can basically be most effective in providing that compute. And the same applies to, you know, Polygon ZK EVMs. There's a lot of those that people are deploying now, you know, zkSync, zkStack, and then Starknet stuff. So that's sort of where we are. We don't have like a very fleshed out timeline for testnet, but aiming to have like a testnet viable implementation done this summer or so. The DevNet is already very like useful, like it actually generates proofs. The downside of the DevNet is we can't charge people, because it doesn't have any economics, and so we do have an incentive to move forward, and also to get to a point where we can start making sure the economics make sense. But at the same time, like the DevNet in and of itself is already quite a useful thing for a lot of these projects, because you can genuinely already offload your compute the moment that launches.
How can people like developers? How can developers get involved in being part of the DevNet?
We put out a blog post, I think it was last week. DevNet onboarding begins. That has instructions for key generation. So because it's permissioned, you need to register a key in order to get access. Anyone can go and follow those instructions. You just use a CLI to generate a key. It takes about 3 seconds. And then you register that through a form. And then we onboard you the moment we can. That's kind of the way right now.
Sounds great. I'll be sure to include the links in the description. Teemu, before I let you go, since you're well-versed in layer 2 rollups, do you have any specific that you admire more?
You mean a specific rollup?
Yeah.
Not really. So I need to say I have a lot of bias here. sort of underlying. The company that I founded, that Gevulot spun out of, was called Equilibrium Group, and some of Equilibrium Group's entities work very closely with Starknet and zkSync. So as a small disclosure, but I think out of like the big players, the sort of like ones that people will have heard of, I think everyone has like a slightly different approach and also a slightly different style of going about things. So I don't know. I respect all of them for different reasons. And I think it's super important that there is like a diversity of different options. The one thing that I'm like maybe paying attention to most right now is what I would call rollup abstraction, or the flip side of which Justin Drake calls rollup fragmentation. So basically the idea of like, how do we make the user experience of rollups as an entire class sort of much more friendly. And so there's a couple approaches being explored to that. Nil is exploring this sort of shared state approach with their ZK sharding thing. Espresso Systems is doing shared sequencing, which is kind of like trying to get at it from a different point in the stack. And so I think those projects are in some ways most important in terms of making everything really useful for people. But this is sort of like a technology thing. Like once we figure out the right approach, then probably everyone will adopt it and so on. So it's not so much like this project is the best. It's just like that whoever is exploring that area is very interesting to me right now.
Amazing. Well, Teemu, thanks so much for sharing your insights and also your journey, how you started in crypto, and also everything that you're working on with Gevulot. It's exciting to talk to you about this just because it's so early on. And I think that a lot of the listeners that tune in, they love hearing about projects that nobody else has heard of. And so you're still very early on. You're in DevNet, and then you have testnet potentially this summer. So I'm looking forward to following along on your journey. I'll be sure to include your X account as well, so we can all follow along. And best of luck. Would love to have you back soon.
I would love to be back. Thanks for having me.